football and the strike, people seem to have made it, so it's really rather wonderful, as well as our speaker getting here and our interpreter. And Joel, of course. This evening's speaker, Dr. Bob Imrie from Rod Holloway College. We have known now for about 3 years on the course. He has written many, many papers relating to this issue, relating to access issues, and last year a book, Disability in the City, which raises lots of questions about attitudes of designers and planners, and this whole strategy of the way we create environments which are disabling from ignorance and lack of awareness and lack of will. He's going to continue this theme this evening with slides and his talk. I'd like to welcome Bob.
Right. Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. It's very good to be back here yet again, despite getting soaked walking over from Waterloo Station. I guess the first barrier has already been encountered in terms of barriers to inclusion, which is this podium, which I'm not used to talking in front of. I prefer to actually be out front and trying to converse and debate. But what I would like to do is to encourage at any point during the next 45 minutes for people, if they would like to actually ask questions or to stop me and to make any particular points that they seem is relevant to what I have to say. Now, what I want to do is to really talk around the topic of really what I've entitled Barriers to Inclusion within the Built Environment. And in doing so, I'm really going to talk about a range of social and structural situations that disabled people find themselves in their daily lives with regards to seeking to move around and to gain access to various facets of the built environment itself. Now, a range of people have obviously written and talked about the problems which disabled people face. And I don't think it's any exaggeration to really state that in each and every day lives of a whole range of different types of people with physical and mental impairments, that they themselves have to run the gauntlet of an environment that we could really regard as an assault course. An assault course which really is insensitive to their bodily type, shape, size, physiology, movement, whole being, if you like, in a whole range of different ways. And I think we can illustrate this in many different ways. Let me just give you 3 examples which strike me as being perhaps really quite ironic in their form. The first relates to an organisation that we probably all have to heart. I hope that's focused. Now, 3 years ago, I was walking around Washington, D.C. in North America, and I decided to visit the equivalent of the Royal Institute of British Architects within Washington itself, the Institute of American Architects institution. What we see here is their main entrance into their building. And the main entrance is characterised by steps leading up into the building itself. And really what's interesting about this is the notice, which states all deliveries use the 18th Street loading dock. And pictured beneath that is the universal sign of wheelchair-bound persons, which is similarly indicating that those people are unable by themselves to go up the steps to come in through the rear entrance with the deliveries. I think it also, we see other examples of such things. And again in Washington, D.C., what again caught my eye as a second...
Slow it down just a little bit, please.
Okay. What also caught my eye as a second illustration is this. This is an insurance company, and on the door it states that if you're a disabled person, please ring and wait for attention. There is a separate entrance for the so-called able-bodied, the so-called normal type or population, and then this separate door for disabled individuals. Now, I walked up to that and I pressed the bell on a few occasions, and the security person sitting in the foyer looked at me, looked down, looked up, looked down, and made no attempt to open the door for me. Now, he may well have made the judgment that me standing up, that I myself was so-called able-bodied and not reading or needing attention. But I think the point, of course, here is that for a disabled person, they're automatically put into a position of being dependent upon another person to actually facilitate their access and their mobility. Something which is which is too often frequent. Now, a third example, which is more recent and more close to home, really occurred in the election of May 1997. Now, on May the 1st, 1997, all of us over 18, you would think, had the right to exercise our vote. But for 70% of polling stations which were being used that day, and 70% of polling stations were not wheelchair accessible. And in this sense, we really see a form of lockout of the type which Mike Oliver really depicts on his 1990 book, The Politics of Disablement. Really, I think, quite a stark image, and an image which portrays quite clearly not only disabled people of a particular type being locked out of the built environment, but being denied a basic right, a right to exercise their vote, and with it, to make some difference to the wider political makeup of our governments. Now, the three examples I've given are examples of which you can find many. But these examples really, if you like, really are indicative of a range of social, attitudinal, and also physical barriers which, on a daily basis, disabled people have to confront. And of course, it's not just about confronting the physical barriers per se, because underlying physical barriers are the social and attitudinal barriers, the prejudices and the associated forms of oppression and discrimination which really go with those attitudes themselves. Now, what I want to do is to really build on that statement by looking at some of the key barriers to the inclusion of disabled people into the built environment. And I want to do this in two different ways. I want to spend a few moments just outlining 6 different barriers, different but connected, 6 different barriers which disabled people really have to really confront and to, if you like, interact with in terms of their daily experiences of the built environment. And then secondly, I want to really consider questions about overturning barriers to inclusion. How and in what ways can different types of disabled people seek to really, if you like, eradicate discrimination, prejudice, the social attitudinal barriers, as well as the physical barriers to their wider inclusion within the built environments around us. Right. Okay, now firstly what I'd like to do then is to really consider 6 different barriers to disabled people's inclusion within the built environments. Now, of course, one could really identify perhaps many more than 6, and I don't think the number in any sense is important. But it seems to me that there are at least 6 significant factors which need to be addressed and to be thought of. Now, the first, and by virtue of being first, I'm not really indicating that it's by far the most important. But really, I think the first, really, to my mind, really relates to the building and design professions. Now, I think it's important in terms of disabled people seeking to develop a politics of opposition to the prejudices in the built environment. And it's important for them not to blame particular professionals or to blame particular segments of society. Because I think to blame particular parties is to really miss some of the wider structural and political contexts which condition the way agents and particular types of professions themselves operate. But nonetheless, it is also important to recognise that certain professions really are important in conditioning the day-to-day living experiences that disabled people have with regards to the built environment. Now, when we think about the building and design professions, we really are talking about many different types of institutions and actors, through from property developers to design teams, to planners, but in particular to architects. And what I'd like to do is just to make a number of comments about architects and the way in which particular architectural ideas are implicated in creating barriers to disabled people's inclusion. Now, certainly I think the first point I would make here is that for many architects, the type of training that they themselves receive tends to be premised on a particular conception of the body. And it tends to really see the body as machine-like. Many people really talk about the idea of a machine aesthetic, comparing bodies to machines. The idea that a body is an interlocking series of parts, components, prefigured to operation, fixed, mechanical, and the like. And certainly I think if we look at the different sort of architectural traditions, which really is a lecture in itself, there is a clear lineage, or a clear, if you like, line of thinking and of ideas, through from Vitruvius through to, for example, the works of Le Corbusier, particularly Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier was very important in really propagating the idea of people, or as he termed it, man, as machine. Now, really what's interesting about different conceptions that architects are really born and brought into is the idea that people can be really conceived of as standard, as type, as similar, as the same, as prefigured in a whole range of different ways. And really because of this, the body then becomes conceived of as type. In other words, for architects, the idea of physiology as different, as diverse, as somehow really quite different to a standard, pre-configured type is often alien. And certainly when we look at particular systems of thinking through architectural history, then we see this, if you like, idea of people as standard, as similar, being one of the key elements in the way in which architects begin to think about design and architecture itself. Of course, this is very much linked to the idea that one can really, if you like, distill a normal type. That from bodily variation, from physiological variation, that a standard type can actually be identified. And from that, building, form, design can then be, if you like, designed. So within this particular context then, we begin to see the emergence of an architecture which is pre-configured, which tends not to be sensitized, and does not really, in a sense, give itself the possibilities of being sensitized to the sheer physiological diversities, the sheer diversity in the way in which bodies themselves might be used. Now, one example of this, again going back to the work of Le Corbusier. Now, Le Corbusier really had a much more sensitive understanding of these issues than I have time to talk about today. But nonetheless, he himself was concerned with developing standardization, particularly in the 1920s and early 1930s. And much of this really is crystallized by the late 1940s through his conception of the modular man, not person, not woman. And I think what's interesting here for disabled persons is that what we see here is the propagation of the person as standard type. Now, for Le Corbusier, this standard type is made up of infinite measures, infinite variations in terms of movement, so he himself would claim. But what we see here is a projection of the able-bodied normal, of a taut, upright, seemingly able person, a person who appears not to be hard of hearing, nor a person bereft, certainly, of vision itself. Again, we see other examples really through history, through time, in terms of the way in which design has sought, if you like, to mark out disabled people as somehow abnormal. And certainly when it comes to the design of the built environment, then architects' conceptions of the body as somehow a standard, normal type, is playing off the idea that anything which is not that is abnormal, not to be designed for, to be, if you like, ignored and kept out of the equation itself. Now that really, to me, is one of the most important arenas within which barriers to inclusion occur, at the formative level of ideas, the formative level of thinking about what bodies are, how bodies should be built for, how users need to be integrally, if you like, connected to the design process as a whole. Now just moving on, a second barrier that we can refer to really relates to the dominance of what we call a medical model in architectural and planning professions. That is, the dominance of a medical model in the architectural and planning professions. Now, architects, not in total, but let me generalize for the sake of brevity. Architects, designers, planners, and this has really been reaffirmed by my own research in talking to such individuals, tend to conceive of disability as a form of physical and or mental impairment, as a disease somehow. So the design professions, the planning, building professions, tend to see disability as somehow an individual state of being. That the disability is an impairment, it's akin to a medical condition like a disease. It's connected intimately to physiology, to the physical being or mental state of a body. And certainly for architects and planners, in conceiving of disability as a medical condition, then that system of thinking tends to lead to one whereby architects and planners would argue that disabled people need to be cured by doctors, by medics, through rehabilitation, and that disabled people need to really fit themselves to the environment, not the environment to be changed and fitted to them. So architects, designers, planners, in operating with a medical model, will argue that the problem rests not with them in producing poor and or deficient design, but that the problem really relates to the individual who has a disease, an impairment, and that needs to be fixed through rehabilitation, medical aid, through cure in a whole range of different ways. Now, certainly for me, and I think for many people within the wider disability movement, see this as a fundamental problem. That while professions regard disability as impairment, as a physiological condition, then that will lead to a blame the victim attitude. That the individual is responsible, that they themselves need to fit themselves to the place, the environment. The environment is fine, there are no problems with that, nor the practices of architects, planners, and so on. And certainly in the researches that I've done in talking to architects and planners, time and again, their definitions of disability revolve around this medical notion. And in doing so, they themselves regard that they need do little or nothing to change the environment itself. I think, of course, what's interesting here is that linked to this medicalisation, this medical conception of disability that architects and planners tend to hold, that again, my research and research by others show very clearly that architects define disability primarily in terms of the wheelchair. That in designing for disability, in creating an accessible space, that it's sufficient to create entry, exit, and other points of access for people using a wheelchair. But yet, as I guess many of us know, only 5% of registered disabled people in the UK use a wheelchair. And many of those only need to use it on occasions. So the point, of course, here is that the range of physical and or mental impairments are vast and enormous, and are much more than, say, for example, this stereotypical conception of disability as a wheelchair user. But yet, architectural conceptions of access, design, so too those of planners, tend to reinforce this stereotypical conception that it's sufficient to build and create access for the wheelchair user themselves. Are you right? Are you okay? Do you want to rest for a minute? You're okay? Okay? All right. Right. Whoops. So that's really the second barrier, which is certainly connected to the first in terms of attitudes and particular ideas. What I'll do, I'll just talk about a third barrier, and then we'll have a break for just a couple of minutes to give the signer here a break particularly. Now, a third barrier, and a barrier which is, I think, very close to the hearts of disabled people at this point in time in campaigning for their civil rights, really relates to statutory provision, relates to legislation, relates to statute, it relates to the wider systems of governance or control for access in the built environment. Now, to use perhaps a generalisation, I think certainly in the British context, I mean, what's quite interesting, I'm doing some work in Sweden at the moment, comparing the attitudes of property developers and architects in Sweden with property developers and architects in Britain. And all of the architects and property developers in Sweden are saying, wow, Britain, it's so progressive. You have the Disability Discrimination Act. Surely this must be the land of enlightenment and of barrier freedom. And I'm scratching my head because I went over there because I thought the reverse. So I'm in the middle of trying to sort this one out in terms of Swedish perceptions of Britain and my perceptions of Sweden, which appear to be really at odds with each other. But nonetheless, the Disability Discrimination Act, which came into force in 1996, really has been heralded as the move towards the civil rights agenda, where essentially the existence of barriered environments is seen as tantamount to the oppression and discrimination of disabled people. But yet, if we look at the range of legislation over the last 20 years, then the legislation in Britain has been weak, what I would also term ineffectual. It lacks teeth, it lacks the ability to enforce. It's based on a term that I would call voluntaristic. The legislation is what I would term voluntaristic. And by that, what I mean is that it's up to developers and architects to volunteer to provide accessible spaces, accessible design. The legislation is not coercive. It still really provides developers and the wider development industry with the power to really set the agenda as a whole. Now, the general attitudes really of governments, even the new Labour government, I think were very much highlighted under the last administration. And the last administration, in many ways, re-emphasised the importance of minimal control, minimal regulation over what developers do and don't do. And let me just give you a taste of some of the attitudes which we can identify. Okay, I hope people can read that from the rear there. Essentially, what we have here are two statements from the last Tory administration. One by David Curry, Minister of Local Government, another by Albury, so too in the Ministry of Local Government himself. And just to quote what David Curry said in 1993, whilst committed to creating an environment more accessible to people with disabilities, we must ensure that any additional costs do not bear unreasonably heavy on those who provide and use buildings or on the community, which ultimately pays the price for goods and service. Now, there seems to be an assumption built into that, of course, that disabled people do not use buildings in many respects. But essentially, these particular attitudes are attitudes which reinforce the idea that disabled people are marginal, are marginals, are insignificant, and should remain so, and that their particular so-called minority viewpoint should not be permitted to infringe on the free market operations of developers, architects, and others involved in the provision of buildings and so forth. Now, this type of attitude has been repeated time and time again. It was first really seen in 1970 with the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act. 1970, the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, which stated that developers should provide access where practicable and reasonable. So the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, 1970, states, yes, developers should provide access, but only where practicable and reasonable. Now, nothing has changed, really, because what we see here with the terms practicable and reasonable are two very broad and general terms, which are more or less meaningless. They're so vague, so open to interpretation, that they can be interpreted to mean more or less nothing, and in particular, to mean do more or less nothing. And in many respects, that really has been the history and the record of property developments in the last 25 years. Again, we see this being reinforced in the Disability Discrimination Act, which in actual fact says very little about access to buildings, and only says something about access to buildings where, for example, disabled people need to gain access to services, goods, and places of employment. And again, it seems clear that the legislation is couched in such a general form to actually really provide little by way of teeth for disabled people to use to actually pursue developers. Do you want to rest? All right. Are there any questions or points that people would like to put? Yeah, fire away.
I always end up defending architects, which isn't something I do except when I'm here and I'm the only architect.
Could you speak close, slowly and clearer, please, Andrew?
Okay.
This gentleman's trying to have a rest anyway. Make it brief.
Oh, sorry.
It's not brief. First of all, I think it's a shame that you use Le Corbusier as your example, because I think that image you portray says something about the 1930s.
Yeah.
But I don't think it says very much about the architectural profession. It says you could use Ford, possibly Berkeley, Stalin, anything to illustrate the 30s. The idea of the man machine was prevalent at the time. It's not really relevant.
What do you mean it's not very relevant?
The idea of human being as machine was a popular idea in the 1930s, and it's not. It was a fashion of the time that has no relevance in the 1990s.
Well, I disagree. I mean, I think that it has relevance. So many architects actually bring forward those particular conceptions. They may not articulate it as man-machine, but they still operate with the conception of the body as type.
Okay,
Well, there are examples where they don't do that. For example.
I'll finish and then. I'm talking about this particular image. I'm talking about Le Corbusier. I'm talking about that particular part of architectural history. I think architects in general have the same cross-section of attitudes you would find anywhere else where disability issues aren't something people are trained in. Obviously, you can say that architects look for, if you like, a standard. For example, if they're trying to decide on the height of a kitchen unit or something. But then the kitchen unit designer does, a developer does, the person in the kitchen shop does, whatever.
Yeah. Yes, I'd agree with you. I mean, I think it's much more widespread than architects. And
the point I'm making is that I think what you're saying is that if someone isn't, as we stand at the moment in our unenlightened times, somebody isn't trained,
Yeah. No, I agree with I do agree with what you're saying. I think that Le Corbusier, one has to understand him in his context, for sure. And I think that where he himself developed his conception of man as machine is very much in the 20s and early 30s. Although, of course, The Modular Person was published in 1947. But nonetheless, I think it is something that's very much contextually specific. Having said that, I have just finished doing a postal survey of 730 architectural practices in the UK. And I've asked them these questions about body types, and they're all coming out with body as type, as standard. And this is material I'm writing up at the moment, in which I'll have prepared to give a lecture form in the next sort of 2 months or so. But having said that, again, I argue that, right, architects are in no way outside of society. They themselves are actually implicated in wider societal attitudes. Sorry.
Can we stop for...
Yeah, you want a break? Yeah. So we'll have a genuine break. Right, okay, question here. Yeah,
Okay,
comment.
It's actually a question leading on from that following point. So I went to visit one of Le Corbusier's buildings in Marseille, his first building. In Marseille, in southern France. Just to look at it and see what it was like. And in terms of a total range of accessible buildings, it wasn't at the bottom end where I expected it to be. It had a level entrance, most of the doors were wide, so it was inclusive for a variety of people. And in the bar area, there was somebody in a wheelchair using the bar and playing cards with his friends, and there may well have been other disabled people I didn't know about. It was just as an observation. But it was very interesting because I thought, okay, so here's a guy who thinks about man as a machine, and at the time it was a conceptual way of thinking. And he designed a building, the lifts were also accessible, that could be used to a certain extent by disabled people. So what else has changed in society's perception of what a machine is? Because it seems to me there was a wider concept that actually from the 1930s to now, our societal perception of what man as a machine is has changed. And now it means something that's far more restrictive than it actually did in the 1930s.
Yes. No, I think that's a really, really good point about Le Corbusier. And I'd agree. I think that his buildings, if you go to his buildings, then the feeling you have is one of light, of openness, of level entry, as you say, of the ability to maneuver and to move, and buildings which are conducive, much more conducive than, say, many of the buildings that have been built over the last 20 years. So, in that sense, interesting points to be made about Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier himself argues in his own texts about the inability for architects to impose design solutions. He argues that architects have a conception of beauty, and they have a conception really of the way in which an environment should be or ought to be. But he recognises, the world of practice. That is to say that once one has actually built something, then the user will transfigure, change, and transform it, both in terms of its meaning, but its use, and also its appearance. It's quite interesting because he himself in his writings talked about the despair that he felt with the possibility that his original conceptions might be changed by the material world. I think there are other points that have been made about Le Corbusier, and it's something which really, to my knowledge, has not been looked at or investigated, which is how did and how do architects interpret him? How do they think about his ideas, his theories, his conceptions of buildings, of aesthetic, of form, in relation to their own work, in relation to the way that they themselves work with developers or clients who commission work from them. And I think there's certainly a research project, or 5 or 6, to be looked at the interrelationship between Le Corbusier's ideas and then the way in which those ideas were taken on board, used, translated, transfigured, perhaps became something very different from the original meaning and message which was being conveyed by him. I mean, the limited work I've done on this, I've written one paper which is about to be published on Le Corbusier's conceptions of the body. And the body. Le Corbusier's conception of the body. And what I did was to look at his main writings in the 1920s towards new architecture, decorative art. I looked at forgotten the names of them, a couple of others. And what I did was to read the original, well, the translations, but to read the translations of his original writings, to really try to excavate when, within the texts, and how he wrote about bodies. How did he conceive of the body? Did he conceive of gender? Did he conceive of race? Did he conceive of age, of youth? Did he conceive of body in terms of its multiplicity of difference, of physiologies and types? And I mean, the conclusion which I've drawn is that he doesn't really. I mean, it depends when you look at him, because in the 1950s and 60s, he talks much more about young people. In the 1930s too, there's a conception of youth as vigorous health, very much in keeping with the prevalent political philosophies which are germane at that time. But for Le Corbusier, there was a real sense in which bodies are absent in the writings of the 1920s and early 30s. And when they do appear, they tend to appear as a standard. Now, how we might then define what that standard is, I think is open to different forms of interpretation. And I think there are many different interpretations to mine that could be placed upon this. But my reading is that he was locked into a conception which fits around an ideal type conception of the body, which fails to recognise physiological diversity. Now, certainly by 1947 with the modular does represent diversity, but in terms of geometric form, proportion. I mean, at school as kids, I bet... I can't remember what I said. In 1947, when he published a book called The Modular. And the modular is based on geometric person, or the person as geometric type. And within that, of course, you could argue that movement is infinite. You could argue that a geometric scale really has every conceivable form or type of movement. So, arguably, Le Corbusier had the potential to, if you like, inject into architects empathy to body as diversity within the modular. And that's why I see the modular as potentially radicalizing, depending on how you would interpret it. Sure. Sorry, I'm going way off the point, in a way. But I think the point that you're making about Le Corbusier is very important. In a way, it's too easy to caricature and to simplify in the way that I was earlier doing. Thanks.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question which relates to what you've got on the screen, which simply is that I would say disabled people subsidise a lot of non-disabled people's activities, pleasure, whatever, because of the inaccessibility which they will have to pay for under taxes, like transport, nightclubs, cinemas, whatever. Has there been any work done on this, the fact that disabled people are actually having to pay to subsidise non-disabled people rather than the other way around?
No. I mean, to my knowledge, there's no work at all that looks at that equation in terms of disabled people's taxes and the way in which they contribute to, say, forms of expenditure on disabling environments. I mean, it'd be interesting to look at that. I mean, my understanding would be, well, I accept that that is the case. Now, to quantify that in itself would be useful. I'm not sure that it would be useful in terms of providing the disabled people's movement with ammunition to fire away at government.
Well, I'm having to pay twice as much
Yeah.
for my motor car,
Yeah.
3 times as much for my hotel
Yeah.
accommodation, and I'm having to pay in
Yeah.
taxes for lots of things that I just cannot use.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know of that. I mean, I assume that that type of information may well be collected by organisations such as SCOPE, Centre for Accessible Environments, Radar, perhaps some of the other organisations. But I'm not aware of it.
The only work that relates to it is the work that was done on housing, costs of
Roundtree.
accessible
Yeah.
housing to society.
Mm.
I just thought I'd raise that.
Right. I mean, Andrew's referring to the Joseph Rowntree work. Is that right? Lifetime Homes, where they did try. Joseph Rowntree. Joseph Rowntree Foundation produced a report on lifetime homes, where they have tried to quantify really what the costs of provision would be to the development industry, what also would be saved to the taxpayer in terms of retrofit or refitting or adapting or readapting existing housing stock, which would be enormous. So, sorry, the person in front, did you?
Yes,
And then,
no, I was just going to go back to the earlier point and say that I don't really know that architects are doing anything being like as sinister as going around and saying that the body is a machine. I think just most people don't think about it at all or are ignorant and therefore design for themselves. And as most architects are able-bodied men, there is automatically a type, if you like,
yes.
built
Yeah.
into that.
No, I mean, I agree. I don't think there's anything conspiratorial or sinister per se, but there are systems of thinking which are basically very much it's about the socialization of ideas and about the way in which ideas are actually drawn into and through society, and the way in which they become, if you like, an informant of what we believe, how we act and how we think. Now, whether we articulate them, how we articulate them, when we choose to articulate them, is maybe something else. But nonetheless, our practices are based on systems of thinking of which I would argue architects tend to hold a certain conception of bodies. Not all, but many. And I think the gender point you make is very appropriate.
I think certainly, probably we're faced with admitting or not admitting or ignorance. If there is a system already prevalent, I can see that people would fall back on it. But I think until designers at large come from a more diverse background, it's very difficult to go beyond that because you do subconsciously all the time compare things against yourself.
Yes, I mean, I think, of course, I agree, and of course, one of the difficulties with a lot of the debate, and I think it's partly reflected in the way I presented some of this material, is that we need to situate architects in a much wider broadcloth of the development industry and of the motives underpinning development in our type of economy and society. And certainly over the last 20 years or so, architects have lost a degree of power in terms of their ability to determine much of the content of design and or design detail. Increasingly, certainly I think the economics of the development industry tend to dictate to architects often a standard package or a certain style or form that they themselves have to fall into. So certainly part of my sympathy really does relate to architects in their situation, in trying to work with an industry, development industry, with developers and others who are less than sensitive to architects who may well want to bring forward user-led and user-driven design, which might be sensitive to the variation of body forms, body types. So, yeah.
To Andrew's point, I think those campaigning for accessible public transport have done a fair amount of research on cross-sectoral benefits of accessible transport. In other words, if your client perhaps can travel to the nearest town or village, then there will be savings made by chiropodists, doctors and various other visitors that might otherwise have to travel to the client. So I think in that arena there has been some investigation into the shared social
large
Right.
percentages of the population.
Mhm.
Clearly, the reduced number of passengers on these vehicles can mean more subsidy that Andrew and I and others will be
Yeah.
paying towards through taxation. So his suspicion is right, I think.
Yes.
There has been some research on
Yeah.
accessible buses within the next 15 years.
Right.
This will be one of the lessons and benefits that comes out
Mm.
of that economic study.
Yes, I mean, certainly companies like Sainsbury's and other retailers like to present themselves as being sensitive to disabled consumers. And certainly, to my knowledge, there is some research that's been generated by retail consultants showing what the extent of the market might be by making doors wider and or providing induction loops or, for example, colour contrasts for vision impaired people. The research, though, tends to be very bitty, very fragmented. And this is the difficulty I find, is just knowing where it is and how to get this material. I know, for example, there's a guy called David Skelton who works for a transport authority in Liverpool, and they produced research on the transport systems there and how they will benefit by opening up the local system to disabled people. Again, to my knowledge, there's more research in America where there's certainly more awareness of the commercial gains to be had from facilitating access for disabled people. And I mean, certainly a lot of the political hype concerning the American with Disabilities Act in the late 80s and early 1990s was being forwarded by, well, right-wing politicians, by people like George Bush, even Ted Kennedy, who you might have expected it from, I guess. But they were talking up the American with Disabilities Act as an act that would not only be responsive to the civil rights of disabled people, but made good commercial sense. And certainly George Bush, in speeches in 1990, kept using the bucks and dollars argument that really, if you provide access, you get people in, you actually generate more consumption, you generate more money. And in many respects, the only way to, well, not the only way, but one way to understand the American with Disabilities Act is the way in which, politically, it found favour with development interests, with commercial interests, and with the wider commercial markets within the USA. Otherwise, I think it would have been sunk without trace. Yeah.
This is the key to the architectural problems, that the architects will do ultimately what their clients demand. And the phenomenon of this century is that the architect is more and more serving a general public who have, the idea of equal opportunities is not something that architects would have been considering. I mean, obviously, not many are considering in the real sense that we're talking about now. This is what's going to, this is the motor which will drive, isn't it? This building wasn't designed on the basis of equal opportunities, it was an irrelevance, wasn't it? And this is the real motivation which was going to drive architects. They will follow. Unfortunately, architects like to have the idea that they're the great creators of novel ideas, but in fact, building really, things like electricity and all the things that go into building really are not architect-led. Architects follow them.
I mean, yes, and I agree. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I don't know whether some might talk about a crisis within architecture. I mean, I guess that's talked about every year, anyway. But nonetheless, there is a question about how architects fit into the development process, and if indeed they really have a role to play and or to perform in a process where increasingly design is being led by design teams, it's being led by off-the-shelf packages. It's being led by standard fit and or design materials in many respects. And I think also there's an interesting issue about whether or not architects really are able and or, able is probably the wrong word, but the extent to which they themselves really are receiving an education which provides them with the means to develop a user sensitivity and or, if you like, to in a sense, see architectural design, not as beautification per se, although that is part of it, but that part of any aesthetic or aesthetic ideal has to be connected to the seemingly mundane, the seemingly everyday. That the mundane, the everyday, the usable is itself an integral part of the beauty of the conception of the thing which is to be, the thing to be used. And it seems to me there's a disjuncture, not to me, but I mean to others, to many people who talk about disjunctures between disjuncture. Sorry, not a bit of jargon. Split. The division or split between architecture as art versus architecture as user-led and, if you like, sensitized to the everyday mundane, which may not necessarily fall in lines with certain forms of artistic expression. But that's a much wider debate and story. Okay, I don't know, any other questions at all? Right. We've actually covered a lot of what I was going to say, really. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just finish off in the next 5 minutes by talking about some of the possibilities. Let's try to sort of leave this on a higher note, in a sense. And to look at some of the possibilities for breaking down barriers to inclusion. Okay. Let me just move on a bit. Now, certainly I think we can point that there always has to be optimism. There always has to be hope. There are always possibilities for change and for actually making a better world. And it seems to me that for disabled people and for people who are committed to the difficulties and problems confronting disabled people, that there are questions of equity, of equal rights, of civil rights, of us, ourselves, having the same rights as others, without question. And of course, connected to that, really, are the things which are possible, which are doable. And any politics, I think, should not only be revolutionary in terms of wider intent, but also must be pragmatic. There always has to be a doability. There always has to be a means whereby particular ends can be cultivated, created, else you get nowhere in many respects. I mean, to give you one example of what I regard as a very optimistic type of image. Let's leave that one alone. Just tell us. Andrew's probably seen this one before. This is a photograph which I took in Washington, D.C. of a person in a wheelchair. And this person is sitting beside just an ordinary bus stop. It's a bus stop that any person would use to get from one particular place to another. And this represents a possible scenario or situation, which really should, to my mind, be an integral part of our transit systems in the United Kingdom. But in Washington, D.C., for many disabled people, there is no need for a special place, for segregation, for exclusion. But what we see here is an attempt to actually develop an inclusive transit system to the point whereby, whatever your particular physical and or mental impairment, you can actually catch the same bus. This is an example which you'll see repeated right throughout this city and in other American cities too. Other examples that we see of inclusive design, again, what we see here is a play park, a children's play park or playground in in San Francisco. In San Francisco. And the person who's going around here is an access officer for San Francisco City. Now, he was responsible for devising an accessible playground. And this playground was designed not only by the professionals, but in particular with the disabled children who now use the park and the parents of those disabled children themselves. So this is an example of a professional using designers and architects, but using them in a way whereby the designers were actually led by the community, and in particular invited the children, the disabled children, to be participants, not to be representatives, but to be participants in the design of this particular scheme. It's really an amazing place. It's much larger than the actual overhead can show you. Just another example of it is here. And really what we have really are a mixture of slides, of swings, the usual types of stuff. The whole area has colour contrasts. The whole area is very much soft in terms of the actual feel. It's very much tactile, manoeuvrable. Any type of wheelchair appears anyway to be manoeuvrable around this. The actual fixtures and fittings are placed at a variety of different heights and widths to accommodate a diversity of use. And of course, there's always the situation that whatever the body may not itself really quite fit. But nonetheless, this playground really goes further than most that I've seen in terms of trying to respond to a variety of different types of user requirements. We also see other examples whereby attempts to develop a more inclusive type of design has come into existence. Now, I think one of the more interesting books I've seen in recent times is a book by somebody called Lisa Foster, entitled Access to the Historic Environment. Access to the Historic Environment. And her book provides a wealth of examples whereby historic buildings, which are more or less the untouchable elements of the built environment, can be touched while retaining elements of what they previously were. This is an example of an entrance into a library in Cambridge University. And on the left-hand side of this diagram is the way that it was. On the right-hand side is now what has been built in. Behind the door is a lift. Previously there were steps, but a lift has been put in. And again, of course, it's a matter of, I suppose, the aesthetic of interpretation. But many really have agreed that what we have here is certainly a good solution to a problem of age, of a particular historic era, where access really wasn't thought about. There are other examples, I think, too, that we can point towards. And again, Lisa Foster's book provides an example of access into a church whereby a stair lift is appended to the side wall of the steps up to the first level of the church itself. And again, this is an example of a possible design additive or feature which provides a possibility of creating access into an environment which many regard as, again, untouchable. I think just one other example of the way in which historic buildings might really be refitted in terms of trying to provide some semblance of access. This is an example of filling in cobbles. This is an entrance into Cardiff Castle. And for any of you who've tried to walk into it, then literally you're walking on pebbles. But recently what they've done is to provide one walkway or routeway whereby the pebbles have been graded and levelled off by cementing between them. So providing level and even access, particularly for those with mobility impairments and or for wheelchair users. Okay, now it's possible to, I think, give many examples of really how particular types of environments are being fitted, refitted, readapted, and environments which are, if you like, increasingly user-led. What I want to do is just very briefly, in 2 minutes, just really outline four preconditions which I feel need to be met if inclusive design is to be brought to the fore. And I think the first, and again these are not in any order of importance, but I think the first, of course, is education. Education is fundamental in terms of really guiding professionals, but people more generally within society, about the problems which disabled and other people face in interacting with their environments. I mean, certainly very few planning schools in Britain teach students about disability, design and access related material. Certainly I think for the architects here, very few of you would have had any training or little training about the diverse needs of disabled people and how to respond to them. Although having said that, access consultancies are beginning to proliferate. There's very little in terms of continuing professional development. And certainly one of the problems for the architectural profession relates to, maybe it's not a problem, maybe it's a good thing, but perhaps one of the problems is the inability for the Royal Institute of British Architects to enforce any form of uniform or unilinear standard amongst architects in terms of them receiving and operating on education concerning disabled people's needs. So certainly the first thing that seems to, or needs to be addressed, really is education and providing education and continuing education itself. I think secondly, there has to be a closer integration between the building and design professions. In the work that I do, planners very rarely speak to architects, who very rarely speak to building control officers, who of course speak to developers. But all of the different components of the development industry are fragmented and appear to often be pursuing different types of objectives. So I think, so certainly one of the prerequisites to an inclusive environment really is for professional organisations involved in the regulation, the control, the design and development of buildings, for them to interface, to talk with each other, to connect, and to coordinate what they themselves would do. I think it's also important, thirdly, for there to be more practical adaptations of the environment. More practical adaptations of the environment. Let me give you one example. In Sweden, whenever an electricity company or a gas company digs up the road or the pavement, in other words, whenever a utilities company digs up the road, the pavement, whatever, then by law they have to refit the pavement and or road by putting in access features such as tactile pavement, colour contrast, and also shallow gradients itself. Now that's very interesting because what that represents is a cost-effective solution towards refitting the environment over time, whereby utilities companies, which are constantly digging, redigging, developing, are actually empowered to, have to, if you like, build in access features, which often can be done at little or no cost. I think, though, finally, though, and of course there are many more things that we need to really think about, is that there has to be a much broader challenge to the deeply ingrained prejudices and societal forms of discrimination against disabled people. And in particular, that needs to be directed at the development industry. But in particular, needs to be directed through legislation which is clear, unambiguous, and which provides planners, designers, and others empowered with the development of the built environment with the means to facilitate an accessible environment. Without the legislation, then in many respects we will continue on the path that we already are on. And that's, of course, is quite likely in Britain in a context where disabled people's organisations are characterised by division, by difference, by clear differences between the charities, who tend to pursue an apolitical line, and more radical organisations which see the whole matter as a matter of civil rights. But yet, in pursuing these different lines, they're divided, and through division, their weaknesses, I think, are there for all to see. Right, that's it. Okay, are there any questions or comments that people want to put? Very well aware of the fact I've had to generalise on much, really.
Do you realistically think that the professions will ever get to grips with their education, bearing in mind that things like insulation are so basic to us?
Sorry, would you repeat that? I missed all that with the squeaking.
Yeah, I'm saying, do you think the professions will ever get to grips with the first one, education? Because on things so basic as insulation of buildings, thermal insulation of buildings, for many, many years was never taught in schools. I mean, something as fundamental to any building, which architects should have been aware of.
Well, I feel more optimistic today than I would have done, say, 5 years ago. And optimistic in as much that the weak legislation that we do have is beginning to have some inroads. For example, the Disability Discrimination Act is requiring employers, but also providers of services, to facilitate entry and access to buildings. Now again, how that can be defined and how that will be implemented is another question. But what it's leading to is the proliferation of an access industry. Access consultancies are literally springing up left, right, centre and backwards. And if you want to earn a bit of money easily, sounds awful, form one of these things and go and market yourself as an access consultant. I think it's quite obscene in certain respects in the way in which these are occurring. But the optimism really is that access is much more to the fore. It's been talked about, but of course it's been talked about in terms of commercial imperatives. What have we got to do to get into line with legislation? Less than about we need to educate ourselves to be more sensitive to the needs of people. So I think the emphasis is wrong in that sense, but the outcome might well be one whereby disabled people gain a series of little victories. Now, in terms of the broader question about education in terms of the different professions, I'm less optimistic in certain respects insofar that, say for example, in planning schools where I've taught in the past, there seems to be little sign of disability issues coming to the fore. It's interesting how they talk about gender and they talk about race. They have all of these little compartments, you know, we talk about this and we talk about that. But disability isn't talked about. And it's embroidered under the umbrella of equal opportunities. Now what's interesting, of course, about that is the way in which disabled people are not seen to be part of that particular ambit of equal opportunities. And of course, for me, to divide between gender, race is useful at certain levels, but it seems to me it's important to see how they combine and they're connected. Because women and men can be disabled and can be black or whatever colour it might be. But the planning schools certainly are either not dealing with disability and or access issues, or if they are doing, it's very much as a glue-on, stick-on. And it's something which is often something students can either volunteer to do or not to do. And that's a problem in itself, that there's very little by way of compulsion. My understanding of the RIBA examinations, now this goes back to 1993, so I'm out of date, I think. But in 1993 I looked at the curriculum for the RIBA exams, part 1s and 2s and whatever else it was. And there's only disability and access is mentioned for one part of the whole 5 years of the degree programme of what architects have to go through. And again, it's very small, very marginal, ephemeral really, if you like. Now that's a problem in itself, because it seems to me the individual professions are not dealing satisfactorily with these questions. But of course, one of the problems is they're divided between themselves too. And this is very important in the context of the day-to-day operations of development. And let me give you one example. When a developer submits a planning application, the application will go to a planner, but prior to that they will negotiate and talk, for example, with the developer. And it's at that stage that I would argue that access should be negotiated and built into the application up front. But in legal terms, technical and or legal terms, planners really need do nothing until the stage of building control. That is to say, once the application has been submitted, approved by planners, then it will go through to the building control department. And it's at that stage that Part M of the building regulations governing disability and access will come into force. Now, of course, some argue, well, it's all finished by then, it's all over with. What's happened here? We've got this split, this division. Now, many of the more progressive authorities will seek to connect. They'll actually integrate and link. But many do not, and certainly from my own researchers, more do not than do. So there's a question there then, if you like, of what I would call departmentalism, of divisions between departments, dealing with the same matter, dealing with the same, say for example, development scheme. So education needs to be operating at many different levels, from the formative level, from the time we're born, through, for example, to the level of training people to operate as professionals, to the point whereby professionals themselves are really seeking to work with each other in terms of some common conception of what the problem is and ought to be addressed. Now, some do that, and it's a separate lecture for me to give, but some do this, but again, many do not do this. Sorry, a bit of a ramble there, but yeah.
As a planner, I'd support that. I mean, there is this strange split in Britain, whereas some countries have a unified building permit. In Britain, we segregate the planning process, which is open to public scrutiny.
Some
From the
countries
building
have what,
permit.
sorry?
Building
It's
permit.
very open. The planning process is open to public inspection and scrutiny, whereas building control is still seen as a technical science, done quickly in private. But there is also an attitude in Britain that we shouldn't regulate the details, that it would be unthinkable to ask about the cross-section and colour of a door handle or a dado rail, or to consider whether a door replacement should be subject to regulation. We have this nervousness in Britain about detail, and the popular press is always hostile to regulation that appears to be excessively detailed. But practitioners know that it is in the details where projects succeed or fail. And we all know the white doorway with the very strong spring closer on it, and yet no one in public or private service seems to have the power to have such spring closers removed. So all the architectural design and planning control comes to naught when you have that very strong closing mechanism on in the name of energy efficiency, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I agree with everything you say there. I think that the inability for planners to control detailed design is an issue. I mean, it's interesting. Some of my researchers in Sweden have shown that in the last 2 years that planners have similarly lost powers to control elements of internal design details. And in Sweden, planners have lost powers to control design details. And the power has gone to the applicant or developer. And that is, for me, is a regressive step, because developers can say that they're doing it, but the degree to which checks and or controls are occurring is minimal. And certainly planners in Sweden feel that as far as disabled access is concerned, they're moving towards a British-based state and type of model, and I think that's is an issue. Sorry.
Things like the way the discussion has gone, and I'm not really interested in what's happened to the vernacular architecture that goes around people, rather than architecture that's predetermined and then applied to people. So in Turkey, about 3 years ago, we stayed on this little farm, which is up in the hills, it's a long way from anywhere, and they developed a sort of holiday complex around the farm. They had a swimming pool and little houses you could stay in. And on the second day, I saw there was this guy lying on a wooden sundeck, about 500 mil off floor level, by the pool. And he got up and he tried to a little wheelchair that was on the back of the wooden sundeck. Then he moved over to the pool, and there was a little voice in the corner that I hadn't noticed before, and he got into the water and started swimming. And I noticed that this little complex had steps everywhere. But for every flight of steps, there was a little crazy paved path, either at the top of the steps or the bottom of the steps. And it had little ramps everywhere. But we didn't notice they were ramps, they were just little paths without handrails. And okay, it didn't comply with Part N or any access standard, but it was totally acceptable. So I thought, well, this is great. So I said to somebody, can I go and talk to the manager? Because I think we've done a really good job here. So they said, yes, the manager's office is over there. So I walked down this little path to the manager's office, and I passed this little children's playground that was made out of timber decks and boats and things, a bit like what you're saying here. And that was fully accessible as well. Now I went to the manager's office and knocked on the door, and somebody said, come in. And this guy turned around and he was in a wheelchair. And the manager was a wheelchair user. So I said, who are your architects? He said, oh, I didn't bother with architects. I just got a couple of little Turkish builders in and told them to do what I wanted. So are we overemphasising the role of the architect here?
Yeah, I mean, probably are. I mean, it's. I mean, that's a very, very interesting example. I mean, I'd like to know more about that, and I think we do need to know more about what good practices are occurring, where they're occurring. But it's the context. It's knowing. I mean, the context there is the person that designed it, is a person in a wheelchair who's not an architect, but yet, because of his particular physical impairment, had a degree of sensitivity. Of course, had a sensitivity to the environment, which was then, if you like, translated into that design. And I think what that example really conveys to me is that the user is important, is paramount. But the user really has all sorts of both theoretical but particularly physical, material conceptions of what it's like to be there, to use, to feel. And it's that. I mean, people talk about an emotional bonding with the environment. You know, you can feel it. You can feel it not just physically, but so it's sort of an emotional, sort of mental state of engagement with. And it's more or less impossible to define that in any sort of pragmatic, tangible terms. But yet, it's that which often gives rise to that type of example that you've portrayed. I mean, there are many examples really of good design. And certainly in Sweden, again, it still is a wonderful country for many different types of disabled people in terms of just the ease of being able to move around and about, particularly on transport. Again, in Netherlands, the countries that we know well, where there's still where there is a degree of sensitivity. In parts of America, although parts of America have some of the worst design I've ever come across. So the situation is mixed. In terms of what you might call vernacular, in terms of an emphasis on particular users, again, in Britain, I think that what you've portrayed, for example, is the exception rather than the rule. Of course it is. And it's the issue of trying to make the exceptions into the rule which really is the trick of the debate. You must be knackered.
Come up to 8 o'clock, so I think we have to stop now unless anyone's very bored. Question diversity. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, all right. Okay, thanks.